Hello and welcome to another Partnership Projects NVR podcast. I'm Jo Buchmüller. I'm a specialist family and systemic psychotherapist, writer and accredited NVR practitioner, and a Partnership Projects associate.
And I'm Peter Jakob. I won't introduce myself any further. I've been here before.
Peter, this podcast is about how we work with NVR with young people where there's neurodivergence, where there may be a diagnosis of ADHD or ASC or a suspicion of ASC, and how we support parents to support their child or young person using the NVR principles, I suppose especially the announcement and the sit-in, sit-with. And I guess this comes from a recent experience of supporting parents in an NVR parent group, which I facilitated recently, where all the parents present were parenting a child with either a diagnosis or a child with suspicions of a diagnosis on the ASC spectrum. And me thinking, how much energy for resistance did these parents have left? And the dilemma I was faced as a facilitator of, was I setting these parents up to fail really? And was a classic style of announcement, the classic sit-in, going to actually decrease the parental presence, not increase it?
Well, I was just wondering, listening to you say all that, whether we have a week to talk about these really important questions. Can I just ask you a question about your experience with these parents? Were there parents who expressed undue stress over working in an NVR or not working, responding to their children in an NVR-informed way?
Well, they were new to NVR, so they were having some successes using the principles, connecting gestures, delaying, responding. They were, so the base, the start of their NVR journey, if you like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's already, I think, encouraging to hear. You've used the term connecting gestures, relational gestures. They started out in Jaime Mayer's original conceptualization as reconciliation gestures. And I think that's really important. And I think sometimes in NVR, we have the tail wagging the dog in that, because you mentioned announcement, sit-ins or sitting with and so forth. And my sense is that those kind of methods that parents can use that are intended to raise parental presence are actually secondary. They're secondary to parents feeling they are controlled by something in the child's behavior, and by having lost presence, and often also feeling to some extent erased within the relationship with the child, often feeling they do not matter to the child as a caregiver, or feeling they don't matter as a person, as a matter of fact. If being a caregiver, being a parent, is a large part of who you are, it can also bring about a sense of I don't matter. What I want doesn't matter. And I think that's the starting point and the helplessness parents experience. And then if we look at the announcement, and you mentioned that you used the word classical. The classical announcement, for example, was developed originally within the Israeli model and in the Israeli project, as a means of helping parents hear their own voice. So Chaim Omer was not concerned with the effect on the child as much as on the parent hearing their own voice, the parent feeling that they're developing a greater sense of agency, and I guess in a certain way rocking the boat, beginning to change some entrenched patterns of interacting between parent and child by virtue of the parent doing something that is quote unquote forbidden. It is an act of parental disobedience towards the demands of the child, which are counterproductive to everyone involved, including the child themselves. So to me, these parental methods are secondary to the parent looking at, well, how do I raise presence? What will that look like here? And how do I overcome that sense of being erased? And how do I feel I can regain agency when perhaps I have been in, I think in preparation for our podcast, you mentioned the space model, which is essentially an integration of NVR and CBT principles that are applied to childhood anxiety, where children don't really cooperate in therapy. And the key concept there is not so much parental obedience as it would be to outwardly controlling behavior, demanding aggressive behavior from children, as much as accommodation. I think, well, I've been rattling on enough. I'm just curious what that idea, just to start out with, how that seems to you.
There's a lot there in what you've said. I was struck with, especially by your point about erasure and about feeling that parents feeling erased, because quite often we think about parents of adult children feeling erased, don't we? That idea came about. Dan Dolberger's idea about, came about feeling parents of adult children feeling erased. But that does seem, that fits really well for parents with children, ASC children feeling erased too. And that actually seems quite appropriate for how, my idea of actually would that classical style announcement stroke sitting make possibly parents feel even more that loss of parental presence stroke, as you say, would they even feel more erased through an announcement stroke sitting? So that I'm thinking about that, because that does seem actually what they're saying. They, that sense of erasure, and maybe I've always felt like that actually. From toddlerhood. This isn't something that just happened when those children became teenagers, or sometimes we hear that start of puberty, everything changed. This has happened since
and there's
a very young age to these parents.
I like to think of Steve DeShazer, one of the founding fathers or parents of solution-focused therapy, who, when asked why someone has a particular problem, would respond by saying, "Damn bad luck." And I sort of think when you have parents who are more neurotypical and you have children with autism spectrum condition, there is often a difficulty in the parent's expectation, woven into the parent's expectation for certain kinds of resonance from the child. Sometimes it's easier if the parent is neurodivergent themselves. Sometimes they find it easier to get their child in terms of resonance. I mean, I was the other day, I was sitting with a mother and a son, and I noticed how hard I was trying to get a smile out of him for myself, and I'm just the therapist, and I managed to get quite a few smiles out of him, which was good, and we were able to smile together. But that was more about my need and my way of connecting. And then there's that sort of question, well, what is his way of connecting? And I think this comes back to your saying that some of the parents in your group have had some early successes already in reconnecting with their child or connecting with their child by virtue of relational gestures. And I think there is there's so much mileage in these gestures, much more than Chaim Omer originally envisioned. Back in the early days of NVR, to Chaim Omer, it was a strategic move. It's much harder for an angry child to punch a friendly face. But I think there is so much in these gestures and in the structure of communication around these gestures that can be really helpful. I think, and particularly for parents of neurodivergent children, I think one aspect is that the gestures break down the communication. Communication research nowadays questions the old sender-receiver model because the interaction, face-to-face interaction, happens so quickly. I start a message to you, and even as I start the message to you, you are already responding, which modulates my message to you. Yeah? Often within split seconds. And video recordings and analysis show that. And that can become really difficult where the attachment process is in some way affected negatively. And I think that the relational gestures bring it back to a sender-receiver structure. I make a gesture, and I might not even make it directly to you. Chaim Omer's famous candy bar, which is put on the pillow, perhaps on the day where the parents for the first time have arranged for the internet to go off at midnight, something like that, yeah? The parent is already raising their presence, but in an indirect way. And I think there is some relief. It's some of the pressure on the child, I guess, to respond in ways that the parent might wish or feel they need, and that the child doesn't understand that the parent needs. Some of that pressure is already alleviated because the parent has protected themselves and the child from the parental disappointment that could ensue when the child does not resonate with the parent and reciprocate the parent's affection in this moment. So I think putting a lot of emphasis on these gestures, but not just the gesture itself, but the very careful planning of the gesture, the reflection with the parent on what the meaning of the gesture might be to the child, and how the structure of delivering the gesture can protect parent and child from pitfalls. I think that's really a very, very good contribution of NVR, but it goes beyond the classical gesture that was originally conceptualized.
Yeah. You know, you're reminding me, as you're talking, I'm sort of being reminded of a story that was told by a parent with a child with a diagnosis, an ASD diagnosis, of a way this mother had made a connection with her child through food, whereby she simply took this child's preferred cake, this favorite cake, in to the child's bedroom, and just went into the bedroom very quietly, left the cake on the side of their child's desk while he was in his room, and wasn't expecting a thank you or anything, and then left the room, and described over time how she noticed how his behavior changed, how he came out of what she described as meltdowns quicker, how he was spending much more time with the family. There was no discussion about these cakes when they appeared or when he appeared, and how through the use of these cakes as connecting gestures, how it did change life in the family, and how her husband noticed the changes. And it was making me think, as you said, this idea of alleviating pressure, how almost that through paring back almost some of the NVR principles, how is there something about paring back some of these principles when we are working with families where there is an ASC or there is neurodivergence? Is there something in paring back what we're doing? I'm also thinking about one of our colleagues in Partnership Projects was explaining how she had worked with a family around an announcement, and had worked with a mum who had pared back an announcement to be just a sentence. And the sentence was, tomorrow I will no longer do ... whatever the thing was. I think it was something around anxiety. But I really believe that you can do this. I know you can do it. And lo and behold, the next day, the mum did not do the thing she said she would not do, and her daughter in fact did that. And then they went onwards together. Now that's obviously just one case study and one example of one announcement. But there is, isn't it, we do say in NVR, don't we? We have this idea that sometimes the more words we use, how we can cause escalations unwittingly. Because as parents, we do like to use words, don't we, Peter? We sometimes have this idea that if we can find the right word at the right time, it's going to bring about the right solution. And often we fail ourselves.
And you know, most of us therapists use a lot of words. You know, we are, that's part of our professional socialization, as it were. So it can be, though, you know, I have known some therapists, great therapists, who I believe were autistic, who used very few words, you know, and whose responses were pared down in their work with clients, as you've just described, and who were incredibly powerful as therapists in that regard. And I really like that one-line announcement, very simple, and very clear. And when you look at the structure of that announcement, first of all, it's predominantly a first-person message, at least the first part of it. I will not do this. There is no blame attached to it. There is an expression of a positive expectation rather than a demand. Many young people on the autism spectrum struggle with demands being
Mm.
placed upon them. I mean, regardless of whether, we use the term PDA or not, there are very different perspectives on that. Some people believe that it is a distinct condition. Other people feel it is a profile of an autism spectrum condition, and yet others say it's just one of the things that some people who are autistic do. As a matter of fact, I heard an autistic academic who researches neurodivergence say that of herself. She said it's just, so there are very different views. But regardless of those views, I think to be sure not to communicate in a way that is perceived as too demanding is usually productive. And I think in your client's announcement, that was done actually very artfully. I wonder, because one of your concerns were that maybe with announcements and so forth, we are asking parents to do stuff that will leave them even more exhausted. I just wonder, what was the effect on the mother of delivering that announcement? What was the effect of what she was doing and how she was communicating with the child on herself?
Well, because that particular mother delivering that announcement wasn't someone I was working with. It was
okay.
a mother, a colleague of ours was.
Right. Oh, yeah.
We will have to hypothesize. My hypothesis was possibly she felt her presence was raised because it was a positive, as the result was a positive one the next day. Whether that was that was a long-lasting result, we don't know. But even that one instance of her child being able to carry out that whatever that one function was the next day, that was a sparkling moment for her, I'm guessing. So and if that young person could have carried that function out that once, she could obviously, as we know, could have done that again. So I'm guessing it was the effect was a positive one.
So rather than draining her further, it may have actually felt invigorating. I'm just coming back to what you said about the paring down, and I'm thinking of the brevity of that and how in its brevity it avoids a particular pitfall. Again, the expectation, because one of the strengths of NVR, I think we need to look at in this work at how do the strengths of NVR apply to relationships where the child is neurodivergent, and to really focus on those strengths. And one of the strengths of NVR is, of course, the principle of one-sided action. I take action, and it does not need to show a response in the child at the point where I'm taking action for it to have been successful. It is successful because I am doing what I did not feel able to do before. And I think that's really valuable because of the pressure it takes out of the relationship here between mother and child. And it takes away the pressure of expectation and the pressure of disappointment. So I make an announcement, and as part of the preparation of the announcement, we discuss with the parent, and your child is very likely not to respond positively in the moment. And you know what? It does not matter. And that reduces the risk of escalation, because if the parent is leaning forward, if the parent's eyes look at the kid, if the parent's eyes are overly focused on the kid, making eye contact, looking for the child's emotional expression, which may not be there, that pressure will feed into an escalatory process. The child may show an adverse response, the parent may be hurt, in regard to that adverse response and respond adversely themselves, and so forth and so on. And it can feed into the Dan Dahlberger, whom you mentioned earlier, sort of has picked up on Chaim Omer's idea and developed it much further about the two arcs of escalation. You know, we have the arc, the immediate arc, and then we have the overarching arc, is that such a thing, in the relationship at large. So an escalation, a momentary escalation, will feed into the larger escalatory process in the relationship over time. So I think that's another strength of NVR that we need to cultivate. So I think, again, looking at these methods, not as methods, and certainly not as methods to change children, but as ways of cultivating in oneself as a parent response patterns that lead to different kinds of interaction, different interactional processes.
It's interesting that you talk about eye contact, because that was one of the things I was also thinking about paying more attention to when working with neurodivergence, especially in relation to when it was deemed appropriate to facilitate a sit with stroke sit-in. I was very interested in Uri Weinblatt's contact activity, his work, and on YouTube there's a very nice demonstration of a sit-in staged. He plays all the parts of I don't know if you've seen it, from his conference, the NVR conference this year.
The recent one in Osnabrück.
Yes, where he proposes that if there are two parents, or I guess it could be a parent with a supporter, that one of the parents sits alongside the young person, and the supporter stroke two parents and a supporter that work as a sort of interview each other. They have a conversation alongside the young person, which sort of avoids direct eye contact with that young person, and they have that conversation in the presence of the young person. So I thought that was also a rather gentle adaptation of how, well, actually not just for a person with who's neurodivergent, for any young person, actually. It just seemed to be a very helpful way of adapting that process. I don't know what you thought about that. Did you? What did you think when you saw it?
I agree with you. I'm very familiar with Uri's work, and I love Uri's work. And of course, Uri's theme, as it were, or central theme, is shame. And he's developed or introduced into NVR a formula that that helps come out of a binary opposition. Sometimes one hears people saying, "Oh, NVR, it's horrible because it's about shaming the child." I've even heard people say, "Oh, how do you use the shaming intervention?" Oh my goodness. And then you get other people sort of saying, "Well, you know, it just doesn't matter. That's just, you know, just as it is." And actually, Uri says that neither shame avoidance nor shaming is what it's about. It's about shame regulation. And I do think that shame regulation can be a struggle for some young people who are autistic, particularly if it's difficult to find words for such an emotion. Or to even know that one is worried about feeling overwhelmed by shame. And shame has a lot to do with social exclusion. And often I think the need of kids who are neurodivergent to feel included and to feel they belong is overlooked. sometimes because of what appears to be less resonance or different resonance, I would probably want to think of it. Yet Uri's form of sit in or sitting with in that case, it accentuates the inclusive. It accentuates you belong. I think that's within the sit-in anyway. You know, the sit-in is different from a punishment. You know, like in school, there is, in particularly in secondary schools, with the behavior policy, we have a sort of an escalating sequence of exclusionary measures, right? So first of all, you get ticked off, and then you get an internal exclusion into the inclusion room. And then you get a fixed term exclusion and so forth. So I believe that all these responses have a, maybe not intentional, but they have a shaming effect. And kids can then harden themselves, right? They can act tough, like, I don't care. And what I think the sit-in does is, I'm looking at the child, I'm sitting in the room with the child, which is, I'm not sending you away, I'm not sending you to your room, you're not on the naughty step, you know, you're not having your pocket money taken away from you. I'm with you in the room. Only that traditional form, if we can even call it that, of sit-in, you know, where I sit there and say, you know, you pushed your mother yesterday, we cannot accept that any longer. You know, what do you suggest? You know, that can be experienced as confrontational. And it can lead to, I believe, a fear of not being included, of rejection. So I think Uri's form of sit-in beautifully reassures the child, you know, hey, yeah, something's got to be different here, but we're with you. And so I believe these are adjustments or adaptations within NVR that are essential. There's another thing I want to talk about, and I don't know. I mean, you know, I said earlier, I think sometimes in NVR the tail wags the dog. And what is really important, and where parents get exhausted, is the degree and the kinds of accommodation they sometimes make to the child that can be over accommodation. And I think that can come hand in hand with a disableist narrative, a perception of the child as being unable or having less flexibility than they might have. And then the parent gets drained, because I think the parent then internalizes over accommodation. And an example for that I had with a parent of twins one time, who were both on the autism spectrum. And I'm a father of twins. So I already commiserated with the parents, you know, telling them that I don't remember much of their first 3 years, you know. And there was an example that one of the parents brought to a session, and it was about bread. And she said that there is a sensory issue that one of her twins has, which is that the brown bread and the white bread must not be too close to each other on the table, but also not too far away. And she said this was part of hundreds of things that she tries to do perfectly. And that has created an enormous pressure on her. And on one occasion, within, you know, in the NVR process, she found herself not having put the bread at exactly the right distance, or she wasn't even aware of it, and her child started screaming. And she said, it wasn't even the word screaming. She said it's like a wail, a scream that just goes right into your bones.
Mm.
And she said, but for the first time, she found herself saying to him, well, then put them further apart. And she said, isn't that ridiculous that it would never have occurred to me to say to him, put them further apart? Because what happened was he put them further apart and stopped screaming. And that was it.
Mm.
She said, from that day on, I haven't even paid any attention to how far I put them. Because there's this sort of, you know, a need, I think, to rebalance one's accommodation without throwing the accommodation overboard. And I think the space model teaches that very well. And even if one is not working strictly within the space model, I think taking that element out into the work with NVR can be very helpful.
And it gives parents a framework, doesn't it, and some confidence around what they're doing and why they're doing it, I think.
Can you say more about the framework?
Well, I suppose the space model gives them some sense of some confidence in the practitioner helping them and supporting them through the stages of what they're doing, why they're doing it, selecting the behaviours they're working on in this very similar way that, you know, what we do with small baskets in NVR, I guess.
Yeah.
They're not overwhelmed, that they can do this, because obviously we as a practitioner are coaching them in the same way that they're coaching their young person. We believe you can do this. I'm just watching the time, Peter, because we've spoken for 55 minutes. I suppose, as you said, we could talk about this for a week. I'm not sure people want to listen to this for a week. Maybe. I just wanted to say, maybe not. I just wanted to say one thing, just an observation I've had with working with, and you know, as I said, you know, when we came to have this conversation, really, that I'm at the beginning of working with families where there is neurodivergence. But what I've already noticed is what the benefit of working with families where there is neurodivergence, working with these families in groups. Because what I'm hearing is, yes, NVR is really helpful, but what is most helpful is working alongside other families in the same situation that they're in. Because these parents feel so isolated from their peers. In the same way that their children feel isolated, the parents are walking the same path. And what I'm taking from my experience, that I'm growing and learning so much from the parents I'm working with, it's such a privilege to work with these parents, is that if I have a choice, I will seek to work with parents where there is neurodivergence in groups. That would be my first, my gold standard, if you like, in my own practice. I think I will always look to try and work in groups with these parents.
I think that can be very valuable. I would agree. And it may be worth it just finishing with that, what you've just said, that sense of respect for these parents, and the message that they have done absolutely nothing wrong to bring about the difficulties that have emerged. Those difficulties can be damn bad luck, and one can do something about it.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing it up. And yeah, maybe we'll schedule a whole week next time. Do you know, in our time with Melvin Bragg, there's always, if you listen to the podcast, there are always some extra minutes, things that people would have liked to have said. And I guess there's so much.
Yes. But bye for now.
Bye.